reasons that I propose we have one of these kind of breakout sessions focused on this topic is not because I am in any way, shape, or form an expert on this topic, but because while most of the conversation so far today really focused on grades 9 through 14, and that's really, you know, where our network work is focused. If you look at the language, the authorizing language for the Career Pathways Trust, it talks about pre-K through 14. And I'm assuming that that wasn't kind of accidental. And that, in fact, if you want to build a pathway system in which at some point in the early or mid high school years, kids and their families are going to be asked to make choices among pathways, and ideally all pathways leading to some form of post-secondary education. Then if you're going to build such a system, obviously you have to invest in making sure that kids especially, but secondarily their families, have enough information, enough exposure, enough awareness to the world of careers so they have some basis for making an informed choice. I mean, presumably one of the things that we're all trying to do is move away from an old world in which it was schools that were making decisions based on their perceptions about who had the ability to go on to, you know, who was college material and who wasn't. I like to think that we're well past that. But we're not yet at a world where information, advice, exposure to the world of careers is anywhere near widespread enough. And so one of the opportunities that is created through this pot of money is to at least pay some attention to what kinds of things one might begin to do in the earlier years to get kids ready. Now I noticed, I just happened to read a report from the SB 70, 1070, actually looking at SB 70 over the last several years, and it's clear to me from that report that there are middle school projects, in lots of places in California. So it's not as if this is a brand new idea, but the question is, for me, the question on the table is kind of, how do we think about really building a kind of structured, sequential way that kids, year by year can get increasing kind of exposure to the world of careers. One statistic I didn't put on the table today, which for a bunch of reasons, is that if you look at four-year degree holders under the age of 25, those with BA or BS degrees under the age of 25, something like 40% of them are working in jobs that didn't really require a four-year degree, jobs that had been traditionally held by people without four-year degrees. Now, obviously, some piece of that is really, a large piece of it, obviously, is simply a reflection of the larger challenges of this economy. But I would argue that there's some evidence as well, and I could start citing it if you wanted, that an awful lot of kids who we think of as the successful ones, the ones who get through four-year colleges, kind of drift into higher education because that's where they're expected to be if they're from a middle-class family. They don't have a clear career plan. They don't choose a major based on any analysis of where the labor market is and what kinds of jobs that might open you up to. And then, surprise, surprise, they get out in the labor market and they find that the demand for people with psychology degrees or communications degrees or media degrees is not what they might have hoped it would be. So the point I'm making is I would argue that all kids, no matter what their intended higher education path is, could really benefit from our paying much, much more attention, starting at least in the middle grades, and some people would argue even earlier, to kind of career information, advice, exposure. Let me stop, and I'm going to ask you to do some work in a minute, but let me just kind of find out who's in the room. So how many of you come from the kind of K-12 world? Surprise, surprise, most. I was going to just ask you to talk with a neighbor for a minute, to think back about, roll the tape back. You're 16 or 17 years old, and think about the first job that you got, whether it was a part-time job after school or a summer job or whatever. And so 2 questions really. How did you get that job? And what impact, if any, did it have on your own thinking about imagining yourself and a career and the future work experience? So what was the first work experience you had? How'd you get it, and what impact did it have on your thinking about yourself and the possibility of careers? So let's just take a couple of minutes and chat with a neighbor about that.
I have my screen.
So pull up a chair. So for the folks who just walked in, if you want to know what the buzzing is about, I've asked people to just take a couple of minutes and talk with a neighbor about thinking back to their own first work experience, either as a 16 or 17-year-old, either part-time or summer. I asked them to think about 2 questions. One is, how did you get the job? And second, what implications, if any, did it have about how you thought about your future working life or career? So first, is there anybody who didn't have a job when they were 16 or 17? See,
You mean paid job? You mean paid work?
I mean, some paid work experience. Certainly, a couple of people. But think about that in the context of the numbers I showed you this morning about teenage employment, and think particularly about those 5 regions in California where less than 1 teenager in 5 is working, has had work experience. And if you see, there's a further study about how few kids in the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the country are actually working, and as you can imagine, if you disaggregate that by race, and if that something like among high school graduates, not dropouts, high school graduates, the unemployment rate of young black males, again, remember, you're only unemployed if you are registered as looking for work. The unemployment rate among young black male high school graduates who are not in college but looking for full-time work, a lot of them are working part-time, for full-time work, the unemployment rate is 95%. Only 5 kids in 100 in that category have work. Now, if you think about, if we ask about, what kinds of jobs that you did, if we went around the room, let's get a couple of examples. What are some of the examples of the kinds of jobs that you had?
Dishwasher.
Dishwasher. In a fast food place or
In a retirement home.
in a retirement home.
Department store.
Department store.
McDonald's.
McDonald's.
When they still had a sign about how many millions they'd sold.
They were only at 200.
There was a point at which it was alleged that something like 10% of Americans in a certain age category had actually passed through McDonald's, or a related, fast food.
Is that 95% a nationwide statistic?
Yes, that's a national statistic. But if you think about, the traditional youth labor market, I mean, I think about, if I'd been answering, I would have said, well, I had a paper route on my bicycle. I mowed lawns in my neighborhood. Well, my newspaper is delivered by an adult in a car these days, not by a kid on a bicycle.
Exactly.
The lawns in my neighborhood I mowed by a company that shows up in a truck with adults, mostly immigrants. And a lot of the kinds of jobs that a lot of us got our initial work experience doing have really either disappeared, they've been mechanized, or they're now being filled by older people. Yes.
So when I moved into my neighborhood, I went around to see if any of the kids would mow the lawn. They don't want to do that.
Yeah. You can argue, kind of, cause and effect here, but part of the problem is, is that, but also a lot of those.
No, I mean, even doing anything, labor intensive, right? I paid my next door neighbor's son to do some work, and it was like, he was glad to get the money. That was it. One day, he never wanted to come back. He didn't want to do the work.
I wonder, I'd like to piggyback on just that comment, but also, I wonder how much of that is attributed to like organized sports, because in my day, there really wasn't that kind of organized sports, but both of my kids have been involved in a lot of sports, and either you're involved in sports and it takes up time in the weekends, and after school, you can't make commitments on both sides, so you're making choices. So when you brought that statistic up, I was wondering if that's across the board, or is it just certain, and you said unemployment, so these are kids that are seeking
Right, they're
employment.
seeking employment, correct.
Yeah. So.
I mean, in that case, those were employment those were employment to population ratio numbers, so that wouldn't mean the denominator is the total youth population.
Okay.
And the numerator is the kids who actually are employed, and that's where the
Well, not all those kids are seeking employment.
correct.
So that's my point.
Right.
Your denominator needs to shrink.
Right. But the big point I want to make here, though, is that if the schools and employers can't together figure out some strategy for getting more kids access to work, it's unlikely that kids are going to be able, for whatever set of reasons, that kids are going to be able to do that on their own at anything like the kind of scale that we need. And you may be right. Maybe it's that other things have taken over. It's funny. I mean, there are a lot of other countries where the expectation is school is the kid's work.
Right.
And you wouldn't expect a kid to be
Right.
working part-time. But we grew up in a culture in which most of us got our work experience not through school, but through, on our own initiative. And if for whatever combination of reasons, that's simply not happening at this point, and particularly it's not happening in urban areas and particularly in inner city areas, unless we can come up with some strategy for getting kids some access to work in the workplace, it's for an awful lot of kids, otherwise it's not going to happen. And if you ask employers about what their problems are with the young workforce, I think you all know the story. You over and over again, employers talk about the soft skills. That's almost always the first thing that people mention. It's less the technical skills and much more the showing up on time, knowing what it means to work in a team, knowing how to resolve conflicts, knowing how to take supervision, knowing how to take initiative. It's those things that I would argue we can talk to a blue in the face in school classrooms about that, but you learn those things at the workplace. You can't learn them by talking about them or by simulating. So that, to me, is a huge reason why, almost independent of what the workplace is, getting kids early on some exposure so they have some understanding of what the norms and expectations are in almost any work setting is really important. Yes, jump in.
So, Bob, you're using the word work. Are you using that intentionally to mean paid employment?
That's a great point.
Or are you talking about any kind of exposure to the workplace and industry professionals?
Well, that's a great point, because I actually think that if we're talking about organizing experiences at scale for kids, not only does it not have to be paid, but the real message is getting them into contact with adults who are working in whatever kind of environment that is. And I think, you can learn a lot of those kind of softer skills by observing and by doing in a pretty wide range of settings, some of which are not traditional, quote, work, and certainly not necessarily paid work. Obviously, for a lot of kids, paid work is really important, but that comes later.
I have a question
Yes.
about that, though. Isn't there some heightened level of accountability and responsibility when it is a paid work situation?
Sure.
It changes the landscape.
No, I agree, and I think I'd argue that by the summer between, say, the junior and senior year of high school, we ought to be working pretty hard to try to scale up paid work experience for kids. In the session on the other side of the hall where Josh Bruno works for this Boston intermediary organization they run a 3,000, 4,000 kid summer paid work program with, and it's almost all private sector. And that's powerful, that's important. But in the earlier years, I think a lot of the qualities you want kids to be developing can be done through service learning, through various kinds of field experiences that put them in contact with adults who are seriously engaged in some kind of, work-like activity. As I say, it doesn't,
So I don't think you'll find any disagreement in this room with respect to what you're saying. But in order to make this really happen, the world of work has to come to the table and say, we are partners in this.
Right.
Because we understand that this is not something we can do. Yet I always feel continuously like it's something we're supposed to be doing, and we contrive situations to try to get there, or build structures like a full internship program to get our kids there. But there needs to be some, because the money they're spending to train employees could be spent almost on the front end, so they wouldn't have to do it on the back end.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I began by saying this is a problem that has to be solved, in my view, by educators and employers together. It can't be done by schools alone, and it certainly is not. We shouldn't expect it to be done by employers alone. But we have at least one employer in the room, and there are. I said, yeah.
I just don't think it's very realistic to think employers are going to come to the table, on their own volition. The point you made about in other countries, kids' job is to go to school. I mean, the other half of that is that those are probably the same countries that integrate academic and career education. So, it's a different culture. We don't have a culture of that in this country.
Well,
we don't have a culture of integrated career education. We have optional CTE, and even career readiness is not. It seems to be still a jump ball about whether career readiness is going to be interpreted in California as something that's relevant for all students, or just something to be measured in terms of whether schools are offering career programs. And I think that would be a disaster in terms of this opportunity for schools to become much more, in around career education. So
well, the question is, you're right to say we don't have that culture. The question is, can we take some steps toward building that culture? And that's what I think, in some ways, the work that's been going on in California, whether it's through the academy model, whether it's through the RMPs, whether it's through freestanding CTE programs, whether it's through the community college, we're moving in a direction, I think, where there really is much more attention to this, and where there is much more interest in trying to figure out how do we get out of the forced choice, it's either academics or it's technical education, and really move toward a more integrated, kind of model. We're never going to be, we're never going to have the kind of fully developed programs that that Nancy was describing in her part of the presentation. But the question for me is, are there some underlying principles that we can begin to adapt in our setting and learn from? And for some of the examples we heard on the panel with Susan and the other employers this morning, suggested that employers are thinking more about a kind of range of different kinds of things that they can offer, from job shadowing to sending people into schools to hosting groups of kids in the earlier grades. I assume some of that is what goes on in the larger companies. And there's always this question of how do we scale up? How do we engage more and more employers? But I do think that there is a latent understanding on the part of an awful lot of employers about the importance of trying to get more career planning, thinking exposure into classrooms earlier in the game than we're now doing.
And one of the points that I didn't make this morning, but I did want to, which is, and it goes to one of the charts that Nancy showed. I think, business people need to see a return on their investment. So, I get what Paul is saying is, we could make the investment earlier, or we can make the investment later, but by proving that by making that investment earlier, and we can work together on developing what those metrics are, I think that will be helpful. But it's more than just the dollars to pay for the internships. When we bring interns in, it costs us in terms of productivity as well. I mean, I've worked hard to convince our internal folks that, that they really want interns, and it's taken me, I've only been, it's about 3 years, it's taken me 3 years to actually now have more requests than I can fill, which is a good thing, but I have to continue to sell that internally. So, but from the school point, we need to be able to show, and I know Nancy had a chart, I don't know where the numbers came from, that by having, this start earlier, and that investment is well worth it for the benefit of the company and the economy and all of that.
And we'll move around. Let's go to this side of the room here. Yeah.
So I think the opportunity is, especially with the California Career Pathway Trust and the interest that it's kind of created, is to be able to shift our mindset in the state around work-based learning as what has always been a nice-to-have opportunity for kids to an expected part of every child's education. And that shift is a significant one that needs to happen at the grassroots, with parents, with students, with employers, with community members, among teachers, right? The challenge, I think, in doing that, and I know you're from a research institution, Bob, is that we don't have any good research that I've ever found to show that work-based learning has a significant impact on students and their futures. If we could get such research in the, reasonable period of time, it would be helpful to make that case.
There's, again, we don't have any research in the U.S. to support that. There's
Yeah.
a pretty substantial body of both research and experience. Part of the problem is we don't have the experience and scale on the basis of which to do the research.
Yeah.
We do have, it's interesting, the Career Academies model does have a research base behind it, but
Not
at the
specific
time
to
that was
work-based
done, mostly, there was not typically work-based learning built into that. That told you more about the power of using a career theme and integrating. But that's you make a good point. Yeah.
I'm coming at this from sort of the minutia point of view as a school teacher and a work-based learning coordinator at a high school who is trying to create this system that's non-existent in my school, or has had small attempts made. I think part of the conversation that kind of came up a little bit this morning was that there are rules and frameworks that kind of disempower schools to change their school day so that they can make this happen. Rules that are not just barriers from the union, barriers that are from the state
Yep.
education rules, the universities, the A through G requirements that don't accept these as legitimate coursework. So these things have to be changed at a policy level, and I have to be freed up to change the school day at my school instead of just have this seat work, and so we find creative ways to do that at our school, but then it's kind of hush-hush that we're doing those things, and we can't be models because we don't want to necessarily reveal that we're, changing the minutes around or this, not because we're doing non-relevant things, it's just that we're bound by certain things, certain other things. So from the teacher standpoint and from the coordinator standpoint, these are challenges we have, and things that did come up, but citywide support of things like bus passes and rail passes for our students, because I was lucky enough to have a car in high school, but most of my kids don't. Most of the kids that need these services don't have that. So these kinds of citywide changes, visions that come from mayors and policy changes are all things that could free. I think there's a lot of creative individuals in the school system who would get back to emails on time and would do all those things that we work so hard to do, but we are, I'm disempowered from doing that by these systems that are in place.
I think I want to connect that. First, coming back to your point, I think that the notion of trying to move toward a system in which the expectation is that all kids at least have access to work-based learning experience while they're in school. If we're going to do that at scale, absolutely that leads to this question of how do we think differently about the school schedule and even the school calendar, the school day. We're in conversation with a national funder trying to, I think we're going to get some money to experiment in a couple of places, because you can't fit all this in without both some give on the rules and just thinking more creatively about, about the total school package. When we do these comparisons of these European systems like the ones that Nancy was describing, we tend to forget is that these are systems in which kids typically from age 16 are essentially on a work schedule that's really like adults. I mean, these are 9 to 5 days, some of which 3.5 days a week typically at the workplace, and the other day and a half in quote schooling. But so surprise, surprise, at the end of 3 years, those kids have had an intensity of experience that is really the equivalent of what you get, in at least 1 year, maybe 2 years of post-secondary education in a kind of career focus. That's why our frame, if we're trying to compare ourselves at all, is to span, the last years of high school and the first year or two of post-secondary to get there. So time and the sort of legal and political barriers are really, important here.
I just want to give a glasses half full example when policy allows us the freedom. So if you look at our ROP rules in California, there are none anymore. There's just funding. So I'll give you an example. We have 6 semester-long externship programs in our district using the ROP as that vehicle, and to support the employers. What the employers wanted to know is that when we're the productivity. So our model has been the first semester as an academic phase, and then in January they're all excited. The students are all now going to spend second semester in these externships, and the employers actually have been very responsive. If there's a skill set or something that a cohort comes through and isn't doing what they like, they identify those skills, and then the next year we come back and we adjust our classroom curriculum and get them there. And so, but before, when there's all these bureaucratic rules with the ROP, you had some restrictions. But right now, there's no rules. It's all locally controlled. And if you work with your business community and specifically ask them, okay, if we gave you these students, what could you do with them? And so it's health, vet tech, medical assisting, marketing, which is more work experience, a dental program, and a fire program. These students are actually in real offices doing this work, getting that exposure, and these students otherwise would not have those opportunities. And they're semester long. So there's ways.
That's powerful.
Glasses half full. We just got to be creative.
So why is your experience so much different than hers? I'm just curious to know.
Well, the
Because it
funding
sounds-
source. We had the luxury of using our ROP vehicle,
Oh,
and we're operating on a JPA, so it's not coming out of the county office.
And a JPA
There's just
is-
a joint power authority. The money is just sent directly to our school district. And then now there's, I'm on video, right? I'm getting myself in trouble, but there's really no specific ROP regulations as there once were from the state of California, from the CDE. And so you receive this funding, and all the rules are right now is there's a maintenance of effort. So if you look at how you're spending your CTE dollars, you can do some.
We'll cover his face as if he's as if he's a crime boss. We
Yeah, yeah.
testify before
Yeah.
Congress. Yes.
Well, I'd just like to make the comment, because I was with an ROP for 14 years, and now I'm reassociated with one, and we have followed all the rules, and you can do it with all the rules.
There you go. All right.
And we did do it and our students got 12 hours a week on the job training. We had advisory boards, very active business. It was an excellent model, and I'd say it's very clear to us that changed the kids' lives. Their graduation rate, because we wouldn't let them miss their English and their math back at the class, they knew we'd drop them. They don't miss a day with us. So the schools really liked the fact that we'll drop them from our program if they don't. So the graduation rate was higher, their engagement was higher. Some of it was paid, most of it's unpaid, but they're getting credit. So it doesn't have to be paid. I'm in a new place where they're like, why would kids want it if they're paid? Well, paid was the minority from where I came from. So the issue is some are successful and some aren't successful. Some were rigorous and high level quality and some weren't. And I think my concern about the block grant is that some will have it and some won't, whereas I don't, again, I'm ready for change and can move forward, but the reason why the ROP program, which enjoyed $350 million worth of the budget, now, we have $250 now, but you don't have that, was that it was regional. I mean, there were those ROPs that needed to step up, and I really agree with those things, but we're moving away. If we don't have something instead of that, then every kid won't have access. And I really believe in working together and not siloing, but I'm really concerned that a model that that has been in place, that has been regional. Let's make that model better, but abandoning a model where some kids will get it and some kids won't. The last comment was, the greatest challenge, because over half of our programs had a true work-based learning component, which was they were in jobs, was access. Because transportation will continue to be the issue. So I support people who say everybody can't be on the job, in the job site. It's true. But we have these pockets of excellence, and to abandon some of them or start again or talk about things that they're new that aren't, we really need to look at best practices. And maybe we have a number of best practices and not just one.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I know there's been some conversation around the trust and trying to figure out can some chunk of money be carved out of that to basically to support a kind of best practices strategy on the premise that there are places that have really done this well, ought to be laboratories that where others can come and visit and learn. Yeah.
I'd just like to, along those lines, I mean, really advocate strongly that we do in California have models that are working with kids before they get to high schools, before they're in a multiple pathway, before they're making those decisions on career readiness, on career counseling, on middle grade CTE classes, hands-on experience. We had a grant program a couple years ago where a number of sites around the state had each individual kid in the middle grades develop a career plan along with an academic plan based on career exploration, hands-on career experience. And if we had a career readiness policy in California, or definition, that kids would have these competencies by the time they left school, then you have the house where you build in career exploration, you build in various ways, and you build in workplace learning because you have a plan for every kid that includes careers.
Yeah, it's one of the states that we're working in is Georgia, where there's now a state requirement that every kid coming into high school have a career plan, and the plan get adjusted every year. This handout I'm passing around, at least, is something that's hardly unique or original to us, but it's something that we've adapted from a Massachusetts framework, which just begins to get at this question of, if you were wanting to design programs that systematically from the middle years on move kids along a continuum from awareness to exploration to immersion, what are some of the kinds of activities that you could imagine trying to build in? And I think, again, without dwelling on it, it might be worth just taking a minute and taking a look at this, because at least my bias here is that unless and this links to your career plan idea, that is, unless we figure out on the school side what a continuum of experiences ought to look like, so you've got to kind of grade by grade each year, building on the previous one, so that, as I said at the outset, by the time kids hit a point at which we're asking them to make some choices, they've got enough information about their own interests and strengths on the one side, the world of careers from which they might choose to match up their interests, and the education and training pathways that open up access to different sort of points along a career continuum. And when I in my first kind of exercise, what I didn't double back and ask you about was the impact of your initial work experience on your own career planning beyond that experience. And I'm guessing it was pretty accidental, but I'd be curious to know, at least for me, I learned from a couple of early work experiences what I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing, and that's a powerful and important thing for kids to learn early on. Learn it when it's not expensive. Yeah, did you want to comment?
Well, I was born and raised in Sacramento. I've lived other places, but I graduated from C.K. McClatchy High School, and I was in the ROP program, and I did 2 internships. My senior year, I did one with the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and I did one at Crocker Riverside. I was interested in both fields, and policing and in education, and from that, I decided to become a teacher, and here I am. I would say it was a distinct experience of, one versus the other that helped me to get here. So I think it can be really that simple. Mm-hmm. And ROP worked fine, so, but as a high school teacher now, 15 years in the district, I have it's very hard to access that ROP information or to get my kids hooked up, especially now that I'm at a small charter school. It's, you know, your relationship is different with the district. So it's, you know.
Yeah.
And just, if I can
Yes,
clarify,
please.
and I'm the cup half empty guy. ROP, as of 2 years ago, was $384 million a year. And it used to be almost $500 million every year. In the same budget that created the $250 million trust, they gutted $384 million ongoing. So in the year 15-16, you will have no more ROP dollars. It's gone, statewide. So I mean, only in Sacramento can we celebrate a one-time $250 million CTE grant while we're giving away $500 million every year. And partnership counties, we heard a lot about that. That's $50 million a year at the state. Now they have to match that at the local level, but $50 million. Look how much great work that's doing. But we just walked away, our politicians did, $384 million every year, starting in 15-16. So when we look at business, can we look them straight in the eye and say, we're committed it? And we hear about college and career readiness.
Yeah.
To most of the elites that are defining career readiness, it is college readiness.
Yes.
Because if you're literate and you can do math, then you're a good employee. So I really think there's a profound disconnection between universities, K-12, and the real world.
I was going to comment on industry, and I think it's great that when we can get those partnerships, obviously that's not going to work for everyone. And I talk to a lot of folks from industry. I'm a industrial arts teacher, as a matter of fact, one of the few left.
Yeah,
And
right.
every one of the industries I've ever talked to, including Nancy Pfister, who represents the woodworking industry recently, says they don't have time or money or the inclination to put a lot of money into beginning training. They can do advanced training. They're not going to get these people out of our schools and do beginning training. It's just not going to happen. They're going to do what a lot of businesses have done, go overseas or go out of business. And a lot of them are trying to come back. They want to be here. There's been some really great articles about that, especially with advanced manufacturing. But we don't have the workforce, and they're hurting. So we really have to think about how can we help our industries and make those connections. And one of the ways, I kind of run a unique program where my kids actually do work. In fact, I have been the proud father, so to speak, of giving out the first paychecks. Because we run a program where we make something, we run a small business, they learn how to sell it, they make a little bit of money from that, the program gets money from it. So that's an interesting way of giving them work experience, because they really do see what happens in the real world of work as they're doing it in a classroom. Maybe we can't always bring business in, but we can use those if we don't throw out our ROPs and programs that used to do stuff like that.
Just, two comments. One relates to the money thing, and the thing that does strike me now is the supreme irony of our time, because the more we talk about career readiness and career technical ed and workplace skills, the less we seem interested in funding it with stable funding. You know, the feds, state, whoever wants to do it by grant, so that some have it, some don't. So that's just kind of drives me crazy most days. The other thing, I appreciate you bringing this out. We've, Sonoma County Office of Ed, I work at the state, but Sonoma County Office of Ed did a nice continuum along these lines, and back kind of on our topic in terms of early.
Yeah.
To me, this kind of thinking is critical in terms of those undergirding principles, because one of the, I think because it's mostly a secondary group is why we're jumping into internships and money for work. But we don't, in California, we do virtually nothing pre-K 6. We do a little bit 7, 8 because they still have life skill wheels and some of that, and we've got some resources available. We do a little bit more, at least we talk some more about high school, but we don't have any, there's really no thinking about what developmentally is appropriate for what could an elementary school kid understand about at least the notion that there's all these jobs. We don't do that. And we get them, I think you mentioned, we get them to high school and then say, here's our 3 pathways, you choose one now, and you choose the one your girlfriend's in or whatever. So somehow getting to that point of figuring out what can they learn. And I know just even not needing, I mean a job would be great, but we sometimes jump over the power of other experiences. We did a pilot program with Road Trip Nation, I think you know the Road Trip folks.
I do.
Well, one of the most powerful experiences kids got out of that was learning to talk to an adult. They didn't end up with a job, they didn't end up even with a lead to a job, but they learned to talk to an adult in a work environment. So just that we kind of deprive them of. They interact with their teacher and that's it. So sometimes I don't know how we have to think system, but also think small and not get hung up that the system isn't going to be ready right away. So,
Can I jump on the finances to respond? And I don't know where everyone's levels in the room, and I'm not, in defense of some of the things you described. But if you look at the LCFF funding, high schools, grades 9, 12, we're given ongoing $200 in addition as a CTE concentrator. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to. It's not the old, because we're going back to not category, but your district got $200 per ADA, per pupil, for that. Now, whether that money is being routed to CTE is a different discussion. But it is noted that you do get, the 9-12 education gets $200 more per pupil. I think it was 212 is in the real number, more per pupil. So the local control and what you do at the local level to access those funds, I think, is important. So I think it's easy for us maybe to point the finger, but you did receive additional funds, which are equivalent to your Common Core implementation funds, ironically. The Common Core implementation funds are also $200. So do the math on your district. You got that much for CTE. So a lot of talk about how we're doing our Common Core implementation in grades 9, 12. How much are you talking about how you're doing CTE? And that's something we should think about. That's my
Excuse me, just a little correction on that. They will eventually get that after the LCFF is fully implemented. But this year, I believe they got about 12% of the 216. So each year, each district gets a tiny little piece. And at the latest, we will not be fully implemented after 8 years. LCFF is being pushed out even further. So that is important to know that school districts are not getting the money. Currently, right now, school districts were told we would at least get 2012-13, which is significantly lower than we all were receiving in 2007. So from 2007, each year, the state cut us until we got to our base, 2012-13. 13-14 was supposed to start crawling out. They said it will take 8 years for us to get back to the future, to get back to 2007. Now they're not quite sure if we'll be back to 2007 in the next 8 years.
Well, I guess what I was just saying is the notion is as long as we think
on LCFF.
no, but as long as we think of CTE as being funded by an external categorical source, you'll forever be marginalized. It has to become part of your LEA's general fund. That's the point I was trying to make, the general fund expenditure. And if you're just relying on the categorical, it may never happen.
Sure.
But you also need to remember, when anything goes into the general fund, it immediately is on the negotiation table. I'm speaking from a county office, which we no longer have our ROT, as we did have it because it went into general fund. Our teachers are right now at impasse and ready to go to fact finding. That money is on the table. When you have general fund, it's on the table. We have over 1,000 school districts throughout our state, and you ask any of them what happens with general fund.
Bob, I
Very,
think
very
the question,
difficult to carve it out and say that it will only be used for CTE.
so for me, the question is, how seriously are local communities, regions, and the state taking college and career readiness? And how is it being defined, and how is it being realized? Because the reality is, there's yes, opportunity to cut CTE dollars and just make it college readiness, or there's opportunity to significantly increase CTE dollars, with LCFF, and be serious about college and career readiness. And so it's kind of, I think, incumbent on all of us to help define what college and career readiness means. And so at Connect Ed, we've done that with the college and career framework, and that's playing out in districts and regions that are defining graduate profiles, and Sacramento's done this, Antioch's done this, Oakland's done this, Long Beach, LA. Kind of, this is what we mean, and this is the kind of guidepost where all of our dollars need to flow through our LCAP plan in order to get all students to college and career readiness. And if you're serious about defining it, board adopting, embracing by the community, by the chamber, by the mayor, by everybody in the community, this is what it means, then let's move towards that goal and all resources flow there. And then there's not a debate about, the categoricals, because the, losing categoricals is, both a blessing and a curse, probably from all perspectives. And, but it creates opportunity to get away from a programmatic approach that we've had in the state forever and move towards a more systemic approach. And we've been victims that have been burdened by a programmatic approach with dollars kind of coming down categorical ways that have isolated every individual effort in our state And we have opportunities to have comprehensive plans that lead somewhere, and opportunities to come together in a collaborative way, not only across districts, but across regions and across sectors, to do something meaningful. And it's just a question of leadership in local regions and local economies, and to do something with it.
Let me
Can
make a quick.
I just make a quick point on that, on the definition of career readiness?
Yeah.
Because there's a
College
tendency.
and career readiness.
Right, but
You wanna
there's,
speak
to-
I'm
you wanna
speak to
going
the
to pick
career
out the
side.
career readiness first,
Okay.
because
Okay.
there was a debate at the last state board meeting about what career readiness is.
Yeah.
And people tend to go to how do you measure it before you define it. And I think that's a big mistake. And I think what Roman is talking about is getting a good definition of career readiness for all students as the state policy for all schools. And that's different than we're going to measure it this way.
I confess, I'm impatient with the time spent on definition. Gary and I have been in a couple of these task forces, both at the national level, and I've been in the state one. I think it's now pretty clear that the best evidence of college readiness is the successful completion of one or more college courses while you're in high school. We now have, I studied some of the statistics this morning, we now have a lot of evidence from the early college high school movement and from dual enrollment that kids who successfully complete college level work, ideally done on a college campus, because there's a cultural piece of this, not just the coursework, that's a much better predictor than trying to extrapolate from assessment results on some assessment, that's administered in high school about, predicting, how valid a predictor that's going to be for college. I'm trying to argue analogously, this comes back to your point about work-based learning. The best measure of career readiness is getting kids some experience of work while they're in high school, aligned with their academic program, and where the certification, if you will, is actually done by employers, not teachers, with a pretty simple kind of checklist, because the career readiness indicators you want from kids moving out of high school, because high school is a way station towards some further education or training, right? The best, so what you're really certifying is essentially the soft skills. This kid has demonstrated effectively that in a work setting, he or she can do the following, 15 kinds of things. And to me, at least, that's a rationale for really trying to build up the notion that we need to universalize some kind of aligned internship, work experience, whatever, as part of every kid's high school experience. If we really are going to get to kind of parity between the academic and the career measures, I think that's at least one strategy for doing it. And we now have, but I mean, you guys probably have them, and I know I've seen a bunch of assessments that can be filled out in like 3 minutes by employers that can kind of quickly give you the kind of basic information that you want. But again, this comes back again. We're not if we're now operating from the premise that everybody needs not simply to graduate from high school, but some form of post-secondary education, then the issue is not certifying the kids are ready to go to work. It's certifying, it's not something that it is certifying that as they leave high school, they've had both exposure on a college campus and exposure at a work site, because presumably the next stage of their lives for most kids is going to be some combination of those two things. At least for urban kids, they're all going to school while they're at work. While I'm on my soapbox, one more point particularly around employers and community colleges. When you look at the really staggering statistics around the community college dropout rate, which is it's a complicated set of issues. So for first-time, full-time students, less than 1 in 3 is actually completing within 3 years. And obviously, there are lots and lots of reasons for that, and Vice Harris and others from the community college side can say with legitimacy an awful lot of kids show up who aren't academically prepared. But the other thing is, virtually everybody, at least in urban community colleges, is working while they're going to school. And because we don't have a strategy to really align, we don't have the norm that kids are going to get work experience that is aligned with their academic program. So those two things are
two complementary pieces of a person's life. They're not two things that are competing for attention and time and resource. Unless we can solve that problem, I don't think we're going to make a lot of other headway, at least dramatic improvements on the completion side on the two-year institutions. Other people are trying to get in here. I'm sorry, we're not blessed. We get 5 more minutes, 2 or 3 more people.
And second comment, try to schedule courses at a community college. You'll have us on doing that. So whatever other issues are going on, I mean, you walk into the help, the financial aid or whatever office, and you see the full breadth and scope of California citizenship, all lost and trying to figure out what's going on. So
that's why I do think that there's at least I would strongly encourage, as this Career Trust RFA kind of gets completed, that one of the things that consortia have to address is how they're going to get kids admitted to and started on these programs of study while they're still in high school. You leave it to an 18 or 19-year-old to have to negotiate that transition on his or her own with 55 adults in front of them in the line. Not going to happen. Yes.
Right, and also those same students that are likely to be accessing the community college system are students who are first-generation students in the college system, so don't know how to navigate the financial aid system. And there, a lot of schools, there aren't support systems in place anymore because counseling was totally demolished, over the same period of years that we've had a loss of funding for career technical ed. So I think one of the strategies that we have at our school is that we have for our seniors, we have 4 courses that are that were reviewed by the Sacramento State University and were approved because we're master's level teachers. We're approved for college coursework. So our students aren't going to the college course on the campus, but they have the ability to earn full college credits in 4 courses at our school. So there are some hybrid ways to approach that that the CSU system is open to, but it takes negotiation, and not every CSU is doing it, but they are at Sac State. So I think that means that at the district level, somebody's got to help that process happen, or it's got to trickle down into the other CSUs. How can we make that happen for the UC system too? And especially because these courses are so impacted, right? It's got, like, I have the Government 1 course, so they're getting Government 1. If they earn an A or B in my class, I had to write that coursework. I had to get it approved. I had to get it submitted. I had to resubmit some things that were missing. These steps, right, on the part of the teacher. But that's a way to also alleviate the pressures inside those beginning level courses, so that there is more room.
I wanted to go back to a comment that you made, and you made it when you made it earlier in the day, and I just really appreciated that there's more success when students have that work-based learning, earlier. Because I was a high school counselor for a long time, but then a community college counselor, and it was so sad to have 28-year-olds and 35-years taking field study. When I'd been in the program, actually was at the high school at the same time as 16-year-olds. And so but where's the commitment? When we go to business, where's the commitment of the state? I appreciate local funding. We have a governor who believes in that. The saddest thing, though, is really bothers me when people make decisions for families and for kids. I don't think that's right. I think we offer choice. And why should you? I know that academics, there's some kids that really want to go to that campus. They want to do that thing. Let them fly. Let them go. There's others that want more than a soft skill certificate. In the world I spent for 14 years, a soft skill certificate, everybody can do that. High school can say, come on time, and you're not tardy, and we'll give you that. But ours had competency lists. They were learning technical high skill work, which enabled them to go into work that got paid higher. We have a precision machinery class where I am now. It's probably the most STEM class in 28 courses we offer. And the teacher said, if somebody wants to be a mechanical engineer, but they've spent a year doing this, mechanical engineers don't have this, so this that they did in high school, even down the road, somehow when they get to that, they'll have something somebody didn't have. And I'm afraid that, I only know this much of my world, but there's so many people who know so much more. So last comment was just local funding. You're still dependent. I mean, I was a high school superintendent, and I was really supportive of CTE. This one wasn't, this one was, this one wasn't. So it depends on the neighborhood you live in, if your child is going to have access to program. And that's why we go category, not categorical. The good thing about categorical, and why did it come along? Because people left on their own were not paying for necessary skills. Have special ed just be whatever. Throw special ed into flex and see what happens. Well, we know better. But are we not doing that when we're breaking down every categorical and saying if it's important, I appreciate Roman's comment, if it's important enough, then it should be a choice. But important enough to who? You know, some making decisions for these kids and families who may not quite have the same set, you know, of defining success or whatever it might be.
Isn't this 250 million a categorical?
It is. You can't, if you.
It is. They call it different
essentially,
things. It's a block grant.
It's a block
But
grant.
it's just that for some, it's so un-Governor Brown to me, and it's so un-Californian to me to have little access pieces, you know, people who will get it and people won't. I don't think that was the intent, but it sure looks a little bit like that. So I'm just concerned about the kids who are either in a school district that doesn't embrace all these choices, you know, for them to make or whatever.
The question, you know, for me though is, can you use these dollars, which clearly are going to go out on a competitive basis, to create some existence proofs in regions, a few regions at least around the state, of what a really aligned system that's designed to serve all kids actually looks like. So you then can build kind of confidence and political support to say over time that our mainstream, you know, dollars, not our categoricals, not our one-time dollars, need to be deployed somewhat differently to make these kinds of opportunities more widespread. And, you know, to use almost everybody outside of California's favorite California district, you know, Long Beach. We brought 65 people there last spring from other states just to get to see at scale what a large, diverse system looks like that has basically said virtually all kids are going to get a high school experience that is designed to bring together their career interests and their academics. Is it perfect? No. But the point is, it's at least, it gives you some vision, a glimpse of what a full-blown system that really did integrate academic and technical education could look like. And one that's also happens to also be very well connected to its two post-secondary institutions.
Right. And I just want to say that I agree with you completely. That's how you get models of excellence. But when the other, you know, if everybody else still has that shot, but when the funding that supports other things going on for all while you're building those excellent goes away, that's what's problematic.
Yeah, but the good news, at least as I read it from the outside, is that because the pendulum is now, you know, the California economy is stronger, you're in a surplus situation. It looks, from listening to Senator Steinberg this morning, it looks as if, you know, at least the relatively near term is going to get even stronger. This is an opportunity to start to build back and to be able, you know, you've been playing defense, you know, for years and years and years in this state, cutting and cutting and cutting. And, you know, that's not going to get overturned. You know, you're not going to undo the negative effects of that in a year or two or three, but at least, you know, you can start to breathe and believe again. Yeah. Last comment.
This is a great group, and I love, you know, everybody, you know, we're all together on this. We have different pieces of it, but I mean, I had a thought earlier, and I do work in 21st century skills, so I talk about career ready and Common Core, and, you know, to districts, everybody I can talk to. But the connections are not necessarily being made between the academic people and the CTE people and the linked learning people, the CPA people in the schools or in the districts. And my thought was, if this was a Common Core institute, we'd probably have 3 times more people here, and we wouldn't be talking about these things.
I'm not sure about the 3 times more people.
Maybe, okay, let's not, okay, maybe, let's keep it, we wouldn't be talking, I know we would not be talking about work-based learning. We would not be talking about CTE and ROP funding and how we can use that. And so my concern is the conversations, because the way education is structured, are being held separately. And when we need to bring them together.
I think my parting shot would be, if I were a member of the CTE community here or anywhere else, the argument I would be making is we don't have a prayer of getting large numbers of kids to sit still for the increased academic demands of Common Core without a much stronger applied learning strategy. And so this is really a situation where you can't, I totally accept the idea that the first priority is around kind of the core academic underpinning and the opportunity that Common Core presents to actually do something that's significantly better than what we've been doing on the academic side. But unless we can help people understand that for a ton of kids, the gap between the aspiration and reality is such that they're going to need a much stronger applied strategy than we've typically had. So we're 5 minutes overdue. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.